how did you get into playing trumpet?
My babysitter is probably the most responsible. She was in the high school band, and she was a trumpet player. And through some coercing, she got me to switch to the trumpet in 5th grade.
Hello, and welcome to episode 45 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of January 20th, 2025. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including a segment that is very meta, some thoughts about inaugural parade invites, some other thoughts about inaugurations past, and I have a conversation with a relatively new addition to the New England college band directing world. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listener. As this podcast drops, it's Inauguration Day in this country. Constitution says so, January 20th. And for the last 249 years, this day has held some meaning to the American band world. I myself got to go with a band to one inauguration, and that story is upcoming. Now, this is not a current events podcast, although last week's episode did feature the Los Angeles area wildfire disaster in the first strain, and there was only a little actual band content in that news item. But you know, sometimes you got to acknowledge what's there, especially when people are suffering and maybe there's something we can do about it or help with. And as either President Teddy Roosevelt or Methodism founder John Wesley said, in essence, do what you can with what you have where you are. Speaking of presidents, it is, again, Inauguration Day. I know, you come to this podcast, a lot of you, to get away from the crazy, the current events, the stress of the news and such, and I want to respect that as much as possible. And again, this is not a political podcast. I got my opinions, you got yours. When we sit down in the band hall, we nonetheless share a lot of common understandings. There are some things, like that 4/4 time signature, that definitely mean the same thing to me as they do to the next person. And there are some things that we can agree to disagree about. My idea of adagio may not exactly be yours, but we can negotiate. But there are yet other things in this world, actions and statements and policy platforms and beliefs, about which it's much more difficult to just invoke the agree to disagree platitude and get on with our lives. Those things tend to be the ones by which the actual lives of persons or groups of people may well be irrevocably affected or harmed, which is to say, the actions, statements, and policy platforms of other people, particularly other people with access to the levers of power. Anyway, in today's episode, the two segments right up front will beg the question, is this a band podcast or what? But on occasion, we are forced to admit that bands and podcasts live in this world. Stuff that happens outside the band hall more than occasionally intrudes upon our little utopia, sometimes to our benefit, sometimes not. So, let me ask you to perhaps bear with me for a few minutes, and if these opening segments spark a respectful conversation, great. Keep it light, keep it bright, keep it polite. And away we go. Let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band podcast world. Dateline, Kitchener, Ontario, Canada. That's the approximate location of an online podcasting and entrepreneurial influencer, advisor, teacher, whose name is Katie Steckley. She is one of, I'd say, only about 3 people whose advice about I can help you make a better podcast, as packaged in videos and email blasts, has actually been pretty influential in how I make and distribute this BandWagon project. Pat Flynn and Gordon Firemark have been the others. I'll put links to them in this week's show notes in case you'd like to check them out. Steckley sent out an email blast early last week which dealt with the changes that are being instituted across the various online platforms run by Mark Zuckerberg's Meta company. Steckley was talking specifically about Instagram. I do post there, mostly little teasers for upcoming episodes, but those other meta platforms include Facebook, which, for better or for worse, I've been all over, both as a person and as a podcaster, and Threads, which I have not been on at all. Steckley wrote, "Is this the end of Instagram?" See, that's the kind of clickbait headline that I'm just not good at. Maybe this podcast would do better if I were good at the old 10 reasons your band could be in trouble kind of a teaser headline, but so far I've resisted. Anywho, Steckley really wrote, Big changes were announced this week for all Meta platforms, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook, that have the potential to impact the creator economy. Let's break down the key points. On January 7th, Mark Zuckerberg shared a series of threads about Meta's planned shifts in moderation and fact-checking policies. While the announcement has sparked widespread debate, there are potential implications for creators and their brand deals that many people haven't been talking about. Meta's pivot toward a looser content moderation stance is very similar to what we've seen with Twitter X, where it has led to a rise in harmful or extreme content. The fear is that this could harm the creator economy by making these platforms less appealing for users, brands, and advertisers alike. What creators need to know. First, about brand safety concerns. When moderation declines, platforms risk becoming hubs for hate speech and misinformation. We've already seen this play out on Twitter X, where such changes drove advertisers and brands away. They were unwilling to risk their content appearing alongside inappropriate or harmful posts. This exodus directly impacts creators who depend on brand partnerships as a primary income stream. Hi, it's Rob here. So far, I haven't had to worry about what advertisers think. I would admittedly love to have that worry. Steckley continues about eroded community spaces. Instagram has long been celebrated as a positive, connection-driven platform for creators. Changes in moderation policies risk alienating users who value safe, welcoming spaces. As these platforms shift, creators may lose the very audiences that fuel their engagement and growth. Rob here again. I haven't been an overly busy Instagram person, as I said. To be honest, the user interface is a little bit freeform for me, but I get that it works for lots of people, so I've tried to figure it out sufficiently to boost the podcast, even a little bit. And as to social media as a community space, I've been lucky to have cultivated Facebook as a silo of sanity, thanks to the legion of friends of mine whom I've met largely through the band and creative arts activities. In fact, it's been such a silo that I've been rudely awakened to the fact that not everybody in the online world is as pleasant and fun and silly and sane as my Facebook friends have been. Specifically, I had to reassess a lot of my assumptions about the general public following the 2016 election. But I digress. Sort of. Anyway, Steckley continues about the path forward. It's impossible to predict how these changes will fully play out, and it's worth noting that X and Meta are very different companies. X is a privately owned company, and therefore does not have shareholders to answer to about their revenue or profitability. On the other hand, Meta's business model is heavily based on advertising, so it's in their best interest to keep the platform friendly to advertisers. Nonetheless, it may be wise for creators to start preparing for potential challenges. Steckley has 3 recommendations for us content creators who are recipients of her emailings. First, she says, diversify your platforms. Now more than ever, expanding to other platforms like YouTube, LinkedIn, or your own website and email list is key to safeguarding your content and audience. As you may know, BandWagon episodes are available wherever fine podcasts are sold, but I also post video versions on YouTube, although they aren't much more than the audio episodes themselves with section-identifying graphics attached. But I've seen famous persons do just that too, so okay. And heyband.podbean.com has been an up-and-running website since the very beginning and has seen relatively robust activity in its comment section, which I can moderate, but I haven't needed to. Thank you, and well done, dear listeners. And I don't run an email list, but maybe I should. It depends on a few things, but if anyone has any great ideas or advice, I'm all ears, I guess. And relatively recently, I've established a presence for both myself and this podcast over on the BlueSky platform, which I'll talk about more before we finish up this week. Meanwhile, Steckley's second recommendation is focus on your core audience. Build deeper connections with your existing community by offering value and cultivating loyalty. Use tools like newsletters, exclusive groups, or community events to maintain engagement. Hold that thought. Although I don't know how heavily I'm into the idea of creating different tiers of listeners. People get worked up enough as it is about first chair, second chair, who's got the solo, all that kind of stuff. And Steckley's final recommendation is protect your own peace. That's P-E-A-C-E. Learn about the tools available to creators like blocking or filtering certain words from your comment section. Even while there may be less moderation put in place by Meta, there are a few things you can do to set your own boundaries and set the tone for your community. Well, the truth is, at least as it relates to the BandWagon podcast world, to this point I have not remotely needed to block people or filter offensive words or do really any content moderation at all. And that speaks, I think, to the kind of people who are attracted to a band podcast in the first place, although it's not right to whitewash an entire group of people, either as bad apples or good eggs. People are vast. We contain multitudes. But in general, my experience with band people has been overwhelmingly positive ever since I was a beginner trumpet in the 4th grade. And my podcast audience interactions have been just as Pollyanna-ishly positive. It's been nice. Not surprising, perhaps, but it's important to acknowledge this. So thank you. And maybe a goal of mine should be to build a large enough and widely known enough podcast project that I actually have to address the issue of content moderation? Maybe. Anyway, the whole subject of Katie Steckley's missive has caused me to reflect back upon a starred thought or two, as advanced by my late college band director, some of which include: there are 2 types of people in this world, contributors and contaminators. There's no such thing as a spectator. And if you don't plant positive thoughts, negative thoughts will come. And every drum major has the right to free speech, but as a leader, you have a responsibility to show good judgment and taste. That's news and notes from the band world for this week, of a sort, although it probably sounded at least as much like the op-ed page. And if you thought this strain was op-ed-ish, strap in for the next one. In any case, if you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. After this quick break, a little bit of careful commentary. Hope you'll stay with me. Okay, let's pick it up at the second strain. In this week's second strain, as promised, a bit of commentary. But first, shouldn't a news item go in the first strain? Boy, I'm blowing up the format this week. On the 7th of January, the online publication Inside Higher Ed posted an article written by staff writer Sarah Weissman entitled HBCU Marching Band Faces Backlash Over Trump Inauguration Invite. It read, in part, "The marching band at Mississippi Valley State University has come under fire after it announced its intention to accept President-elect Donald Trump's invitation to perform at his upcoming inauguration. The historically black university launched a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for its Mean Green Marching Machine Band to travel to Washington, D.C. for the January 20th inauguration, as well as for instruments, uniforms, scholarships, and other band needs. This is not just a moment of pride for our university, but for the entire state of Mississippi," University President Gerald Briggs said in an official announcement. "It is an opportunity to showcase our legacy, celebrate our culture, and invest in the future leaders of our community." He added that the performance would allow students, quote, "to engage in the peaceful transition of power and gain global exposure." The online publication HBCU Buzz reported that Mississippi Valley State's wouldn't be the first HBCU band to perform at a Trump inauguration. Talladega College's Great Tornado Marching Band performed at Trump's first inauguration in 2017. But the university's efforts to send the band to the event prompted backlash. Op-eds in publications including The Root and HBCU Sports slammed the decision as an apparent endorsement of Trump when most black voters feel less than celebratory about him taking office. Social media has erupted with both criticism and defense of the move. Bishop Talbert Swan, president of the Springfield, Massachusetts branch of the NAACP, posted on Twitter X, quote, "The Mean Green Marching Machine Band has a proud history of standing up for black history, equity, and justice. However, accepting an invitation to perform at Donald Trump's presidential inauguration on Martin Luther King Jr. Day is a disgraceful betrayal of that legacy." Unquote. Meanwhile, I was alerted to this article and the controversy it was chronicling by a friend of this podcast who noted in a Facebook status post, quote, "If this were my college marching band, I would remind the aggrieved and objecting folks that, 1, this is a once-in-a-generation chance for the band and its members, 2, participating in the parade is not necessarily an endorsement of the winner of the election, and 3, as the MVSU president said, this is, or can be, more about the peaceful transfer of power." And then, for good measure, he wrote, "Paging Bandwagon with Rob Hamilton." So then I had to deal with this. And in the comment section of that Facebook post, a mutual acquaintance of ours chimed in, writing, quote, "Correct. It is a celebration of the democratic process, not the elected official." Before I dive into this fluffy little topic, to be clear, I am not heavily into both sidesing. It's rare that both sides are just as bad or just as good. False equivalences are best avoided. Certain acts and statements do not rise to the level of awfulness that other acts and statements do. And some assertions are given undue credence by being placed side by side with others. I feel this strongly whenever I see something like, say, a cable news TV program staging a debate about climate change. As an example, on one side of the TV screen is a scientist who believes that climate change has been significantly caused by human activity. On the other side of the screen is a scientist who does not. So it looks like a 50-50 split, when in fact, the estimated percentage of qualified scientists who do not believe climate change is human-made is around 3%. But to the average TV viewer, it looks, and that's the operative word since it's TV, and it's not how you feel, it's how you look, it looks like half the scientists in the world have their doubts. To be an accurate representation of that so-called debate, you'd need about 24 little video insert boxes with people saying, yes it is, and one box saying, no it isn't. In this case, I don't rightly know how much comparative weight to give each side of this question of should Mississippi Valley State's band have accepted the invitation. In spite of being a rather adamantly anti-both-sidesing person, I do grasp each of these arguments, pro and con. My own particular alma mater band has been to 3 inaugurations, in January 1981 and 1985 for each of Ronald Reagan's inaugurals, and in January 2001 for George W. Bush's. I can absolutely guarantee you that there were students in that band and attending that university who 100% did not support the policies that Reagan or Bush promoted or had already carried out. I mean, we hailed from the People's Republic of Amherst, after all. And another college band of my very close acquaintance has been to 2 inaugurations. In January 2009, Barack Obama's spectacularly cold inaugural day, and in January 2021, as a locked-down Washington, D.C. welcomed Joe Biden to the White House. And it is statistically unlikely that in that college band of 300-plus students, there were 0 people who would have preferred the other guy. Generally speaking, bands march in that parade regardless of how they feel about whoever is taking the oath at noon at the Capitol. At the very least, for the simple reason that the invitation to do so is so rare and the event is so significant for our country that accepting that invitation is, generally speaking, a no-brainer. That having been said, the particular policies of a Trump administration, both as demonstrated by Donald Trump's actual administration between 2017 and 2021, and as predicted by the Project 2025 position paper, a document that was effectively Trump's party platform, have been and are projected to continue to be, let's just vastly understate this by saying, somewhere between not terribly supportive of and actively detrimental to the concerns of black people, or of people of color generally. In addition, a great many of these policy positions have effectively been endorsed by Trump's own personal words and actions merely within the nearly 10 years since he became a viable candidate for a national party's presidential nomination. It's been difficult to characterize those words and actions as anything but similarly antagonistic toward people of color. I imagine that this can be seen as significant in the eyes of the people who have posted criticism of Mississippi Valley State's decision to accept the inaugural parade invitation, because Donald Trump's demonstrated psychological makeup will probably cause him to interpret today's inaugural festivities, including the parade, as a celebration of the elected official, not the democratic process. He will probably view each marching and playing unit in the parade as offering up praise and adulation to him, rather than to the country an elected president serves. And, my apologies, but that isn't what any band signs up for. That's not what any collective band or individual band member is doing when they accept that parade invite, even if a majority of them do support the incoming president, whoever that is. This country was founded on a lot of ideas, some of which are famously problematic, but one idea that the founders were appropriately fixated on was their interest in getting away from the concept of offering up adulation to a specific individual. They were thinking of George III. Recently, we may think of Jimmy, or Ronald, or George, or Bill, or George the Younger, or Barack, or Joe, or Donald. Some of us like or liked some of them and didn't care for others of them. But if we're doing this American democracy thing right, we are waving flags and tooting horns and banging drums in support of our ability to base a government on people, not a person. I guess that once again I will have to go back to the well of starred thoughts. When he was talking to his summer drum major clinic students, George Parks always told them, bluntly, that the audience was clapping for the band, not the conductor, so don't y'all get a big head about this. Starred thought. It's not you, it's the position. In this case, it's not you, it's the country. On the other side of this tiny little pause, a conversation which, in part, sends me down memory lane. I hope you'll stick around, and thanks for your patience with this last couple of segments. I kind of felt like some things had to be said. And now, you will be pleased to know, we will change keys and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, I'm so happy to be joined by a band and orchestra conductor whose work I first encountered about a year ago. I was attending one of the Massachusetts Senior District Festivals, so as to be there when my number one nephew played in the Senior District Orchestra. And before the band performed, the audience was informed that the band's conductor had actually stepped in to conduct on relatively short notice, and he was conducting the originally booked conductor's repertoire selections. And let's just say those weren't exactly grade one band pieces. It was a terrific performance, and I remember thinking afterward, note to self, because, I got this podcast idea I'm hatching a month or two from now, and So happily, that gentleman has been kind enough to agree to subject himself to all this. Please help me welcome to the program Professor James MINNIX. James.
Rob, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here today.
Thank you for doing this. My research suggests to me that you are not necessarily a stranger to projects which might have had you kind of building your boat as you were launching it, and I'm always interested to hear those stories. But first, let me utilize my usual opening blast of questions, the answers to which can get my listenership an idea about your origin story, because everybody's got one. So first, what's your primary instrument?
Primarily, I'm a trumpet player, studied trumpet in undergraduate, and still play. Not as much as I'd like to, unfortunately. The conducting baton has kind of overtaken the trumpet, but I always tell people that I should have played the trombone. All of my best friends through high school, through college, were all trombone players. My roommate in college is now the principal trombone of the Colorado Symphony. His name's John Cipher, great guy, great player. And both of my conducting teachers, funny enough, were trombonists, Matt Westgate and Glenn Adsit.
And there's a name that will surface again, I am quite certain. How did you get into playing trumpet? Did you know somewhere in the back of your head that trombone was a cool thing, but you went to trumpet anyway? How did that process go?
Actually, it was quite a backwards process. I started in fourth grade on the alto saxophone.
Huh.
Certainly had some success on it, but I think that my issue was that there were some really smart kids playing the alto saxophone and that they were progressing quicker than I was. And I remember their names, Jason and David. They're probably both, neurosurgeons now. So that was part of it. But I think that my babysitter is probably the most responsible. She was in the high school band, and she was a trumpet player. And through some coercing, she got me to switch to the trumpet in fifth grade, which was a great success. I think definitely a testament that our faces are constructed sometimes better for some instruments than others.
I'm going to interrupt you, but only briefly, just because after a less than successful fourth grade start on the trumpet, I wondered whether my chops were built for the trumpet, specifically any high notes at all, and I went to the saxophone.
Interesting. Yeah, we had opposite journeys. But yeah, love the trumpet and still do love to play. Take as many playing opportunities as I can. I was a church musician for a few years doing my DMA, and I had a lot of opportunities to play during that time.
I'm going to presume you were a choir director type and not an on-staff church trumpeter. Is there such a thing?
Oh, I wish. No, I was the music director. So fortunately, I did not have to pay a trumpet player to come. It was kind of a nice little budget relief that I got to play all the trumpet parts. And worked with a wonderful keyboardist and organist because that's not a skill that I possess. So I was lucky enough to find there's a little church in Avon, Connecticut, West Avon Congregational, and I spent about 3 years there as the music director.
Which segues a little bit into the next question I usually ask, which is what bands or other organizations have you been active with in your life, whether it's playing or waving a stick or what?
I think I was really fortunate in my high school music program to be a part of a really large, talented group. We got to play a lot of great repertoire And when you're in high school, you really don't think about how great you have it until afterwards, and now I truly appreciate my musical education upbringing. So got to play in a lot of different groups, including a steel band. I was also very much into vocal music back then, did all of the choirs, and have kind of continued that throughout my life. I love to sing and have been part of the Richmond Symphony Chorus the most recently. Before coming to grad school, I did that for about 5 years. Got to perform with the Richmond Symphony quite a bit on some really amazing repertoire. So I have that side of my music education as well. But as far as bands and orchestras, in college, I went to James Madison University, had the wonderful opportunity of not only playing in the wind ensemble, but also their European style brass band, which was amazing. So I came in as a cornetist, left as a flugelhornist. I got to play the solo flugelhorn seat my senior year. And that band was one of the best playing experiences I'd ever had, as far as like the level of playing, the expectation of the conductor. Kevin Stees does a fabulous job down there at JMU with that group, and they're still very, very good. And they compete in NABA, the North American Brass Band Association, every year. So I got to have that experience as well. Post college, I moved to Pittsburgh and got a position with the Pittsburgh Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra. I played second trumpet with them, except for about 6 months where the first trumpet player had a massive dental work done, and I got to
Oh,
step in and play principal. And we did Respighi Pines of Rome during that time, so I had an amazing time with them. But my time in Pittsburgh came to an end when I felt the calling to music ed. So I ended up going back down to Richmond, Virginia, where I conducted bands both middle school and high school for about 8 years and had a great experience down there, which led me to grad school at UMass, where I was involved with the concert bands. So the UMass Wind Ensemble, the symphonic band, and the concert band, as well as the athletic bands. I also marched at JMU, forgot to mention that, and was highly involved in marching band all through high school and taught marching band every single year that I was down in Richmond teaching. So 8 years of teaching down there. That led me to grad school at UMass, where I did the marching and concert bands, and then straight to Hart, where I got to conduct the Hart Wind Ensemble, the Hart Symphony Band, the orchestras, the Foot in the Door Contemporary Ensemble, all amazing experiences. And last year, I got the position of director of bands at Central Connecticut State University. So I currently conduct their wind ensemble as well as the athletic bands. And I also, in 2024, accepted the position of conductor of the Greater Hartford Youth Wind Ensemble, which is connected to the Hart Community School and really has students from all over Connecticut and even Massachusetts that come every Sunday to do a 2 hour rehearsal with me. Huge pleasure to work with that group.
yeah, Central Connecticut State is one place, at least, where our Venn diagram circles intersect, and I will go there. But first, I want to go back to your time at the Hart School for a second. Somewhere in my internet travels, I read a piece that suggested that you led the University of Hartford marching band. Maybe I'm late to this party. I did not realize that there was a marching band there.
That's interesting that you found that published somewhere online and a bit troubling because there is no there is no University of Hartford marching band, and I was never involved in any way of trying to start it or found it. There was a bit of talk about some graduate students leading a pep band for the basketball games, but that never came to fruition.
Because I was trying to imagine what the Hart School's marching band might sound like.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question of what the University of Hartford marching band would look like.
Oh. Okay, so Central Connecticut State beckon. How did beckon?
Well, it started honestly the year before I took the job. They were looking for some people to come in and conduct the band just as an adjunct coming in for rehearsals. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. And Professor Ken Bagley, who's a wonderful colleague, ended up stepping in and doing that for the year before I came and did a fabulous job with the wind ensemble. He really prepared the group for me to come in and bring back some real repertoire and do some great work with them. That year didn't work out, but I did go to campus and got to watch some performances because I knew they were going to be searching for a full-time person the next year. So they knew who I was. I had kind of just down the street, the University of Hartford's only about 20 minutes away. And we share some faculty also. So some of the faculty at Central was familiar with my work at Hart. So I got the invitation to interview, do the couple-day process of multiple interviews and rehearsing with the band and talking with the students. And thankfully, it was a good fit, and they hired me on. And the wind ensemble's now up to about 46 players. I think down in COVID, they were down to about 13.
Well, I had noted that during COVID they were remote, as everybody was, but that had continued on for a time.
Yeah. I know that there were some professors trying to get some live music happening, but the restrictions that they had there made it almost impossible to play in an ensemble setting, which I'm sure a lot of directors are familiar with who were in charge of groups during that time.
Fun memories.
Yeah.
So how have you found it?
It's been a great place to work. Honestly, there are a lot of brand new faculty. This year we hired on a new music theory person, a new music technology person. There is a new head of music history that got hired the same year that I did. So we just have a really energetic faculty that wants great things for the department, for the school. I think we're in a wonderful location, right in the middle of the state. And being a state school, the tuition is not as high as some of the other great music schools in Connecticut. So yeah, we're just hoping to build. The students that we have are wonderful. They are talented, they are motivated, but Central's a special place where you can kind of give a lot of individual attention, especially right now. The department's not too big.
The reason that our Venn diagrams intersected at CCSU was my time a dozen or so years ago assisting with the marching band. And yes, one thing that I learned was that band, at least, attracted some wonderful, committed people. They were just great. The other thing that I gleaned in overhearing conversations was that it was largely a commuter school. And yes, it was a college option for folks who wanted a smaller school or a smaller tuition bill. Is that still so? I know they were building a big new dorm building about 8 or 10 years ago. Has the student population changed since then?
I think it is still the case. It to me seems to be about a 50-50 split, to where we have about half of our students in the music department that are full-time on campus, live on campus. And there's about half of the students that live locally that drive in every day. I think that we've gotten to have a really good kind of mix of not only people from different cultures, but people at way different age groups. I get to conduct in the wind ensemble quite a few players that are older than me that are coming back to school, to get a degree in composition or to get a degree in just something that they've been interested in. So interacting with those students is really awesome. I enjoy having them as part of the program, which I think is something that we specifically benefit from.
Useful to have older students in the room so you don't have to explicitly say, see, kids, you can keep playing an instrument after you finish school.
Yeah, absolutely. I was heavily into the musical side of things as a youngster because as badly as I wanted to play sports, the MINNIX family does not come from particularly large, you know.
Athletic tradition, yeah.
Yeah. But, my coordination was always great. So it was kind of disheartening to me as being young and not being able to compete with other students my age in my school district. We had a huge school district. And so it was pretty natural for me to go to the music side of things. And then, around junior year is when I kind of did the late bloomer thing and caught up. But by that time, I was so heavily involved in music that, I never looked back. So
I'm not sure that there is a graceful pivot back to this, but as I was thinking about my time in the mid 2000 teens with Central, I was remembering that as far as marching band performance opportunities, partly because the football team wasn't that great at the time anyway. The band students, they were perfectly enthusiastic looking at the football games to the naked eye, but I don't know that it's fair to say their hearts weren't in it, but they were doing the football games because that was what was expected. But they lived for the high school exhibition appearances. So did you come into the director of band's position finding a similar thing? And do you have a thought about where it might go from here if you want it different?
Well, I was fortunate that the marching band had been kind of put on hold for, I believe, 3 years. So the students were just so ecstatic that marching band was coming back.
Ah.
Many of the music education students, even at Central, that were going to be seniors in their fourth year, had not marched at all. And a lot of them, when they chose their undergraduate, kind of looked for schools with a marching band. So they were incredibly excited to get started. And, we had a very successful first year, I think. We did not travel just because that was not something I was ready to tackle with a group that I didn't really know yet. But we had a great time playing at all the home games. We did quite a bit because the band was just coming back. We had a lot of opportunities across campus. A lot of people wanted us to come play. So we got ourselves out there. And I think overall, what I heard from the Alumni Association, the administration, was that they were incredibly excited to have the band back. So it was a great first year. Second year was, as you can imagine, 10 times better. Just after having done it as a director, getting to know the students, giving them a lot more responsibility and watching their leadership kind of grow this year was really encouraging. And we did go on 2 trips. I took them down to Yale for our game against Yale, which was just a really cool venue for the students to experience. The Yale Bowl was an awesome place to watch a football game. We just played in the stands and supported our team, and that was wonderful. And we also went to the Southington U.S. Bands competition to do an exhibition this year. One of the larger U.S. bands competitions in our state, and it's just next door to the university. So they had a blast. They absolutely loved that. I think it's a bit nostalgic for them. A lot of them participated in high school band and probably watched the college groups, perform an exhibition at the end and thought, oh, I wonder if I could do that someday. So giving them that opportunity is really wonderful.
I'm going to say that my time with Central going to high school exhibitions was probably marked mostly by our entrance onto the field as not that big of a band. It was certainly not as big as your UConns and your University of New Havens and that sort of thing. And to see the audience go from, it's a little band, what are they going to do, to, oh, you can do college band when it's not 350 people and still be taken seriously.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pride in being a smaller band and still being able to put out a great sound. That's kind of been the story of my career in a lot of ways. I led a couple of high school bands that were a lot like that. Students can really feel great about their contribution when you have a little group like that that sounds so good. I've always told them that just means that there's more responsibility on every one of you. If it's not a 300-person band, you can't hide.
You're 4% of the band rather than a fourth of a percent of the band.
Exactly, exactly. And I've marched in huge bands. I've never played in a small band, but I've mostly taught small bands. So it's interesting how the world works.
A wise person once said to me, sometimes no transition is transition. And I think this is going to be the case. Although the name did come up early in our time today, that name is very tangentially another way that our two Venn diagram circles intersect. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about your time at the Hart School with Glenn Adsit.
Oh my. Yeah, being a student of Glenn Adsit is and will be one of the biggest points in my musical journey of my life for sure. He was somebody that was a bit under the radar, even though I was studying at the University of Massachusetts, very close by for my master's degree. It wasn't until I ran into Glenn at the Midwest Clinic during the college night that I even knew about their DMA and instrumental conducting and got to talk to him quite a bit. But then it was just attending a couple of conducting summer workshops that Glenn was a part of, just so I knew that he could, get to know me in the moment of music making, and then invited me to be a doctoral student with him for 3 years. So I got to work incredibly closely with him and just kind of be a part of not only his genius as a musician, but his genius as a teacher and as somebody that establishes community, someone who understands the psychology of music, and somebody who can lead groups into their best performance without being a jerk, if I have to say it bluntly. But yeah, not only, being his student and getting a lot of individual time with him, but being able to sit in his rehearsals and understand his process and how much it means to him. You know, he was able to connect me with a lot of composers, which was something that I hadn't really experienced before. And very powerful connections to composers was something that kept him going. He was huge in the commissioning scene, establishing the Aspire group kind of early in the commissioning process as far as what we do in bands these days. So he was instrumental in kind of constructing the idea of commissioning and getting great composers to write for band. If we're able to pull our money together, we can attract, the people that we want writing for us. And that was his passion until, he left us too soon. There were always new works being done. The most recent being a percussion concerto by Joseph Schwantner, which was performed at the Hart School. Gosh, it must be 2 or 3 months ago now. But that was his kind of last giant project, an amazing piece, and I hope that we get to hear some more performances of it on a more national scale here.
My experience with him was up at the New England Band Directors Institute at Keene State College. It was had to in the summer of 23. He was there as a featured clinician to conduct one of the newly published compositions reading sessions with all of us band directors toting instruments. And then on the last morning, ran a conducting workshop with his colleague Edward Cumming. And in the space of, we were there for a maximum of 2.5 hours. And in that time, I guess I can say, can confirm, not only was the instruction and the advice and the working with individual people kind of a revelation, but he made it not just a comfortable and not just a productive environment, but there really was a little community forming in there. I think that, and it was definitely my moment to say, where have I been that I haven't run into this person yet? And yes, one of my early thoughts as I was putting this podcast together was, I don't get to interview him.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he would have been amazing for this show for sure. He was somebody that was just a joy to be around, always had amazing stories. Some of the best stories that I've, ever heard as far as music goes.
I was going to ask you if you had a Glenn Adsit story that you wanted to tell.
Well, I think maybe the most powerful story, he was going through several years before he passed away. He was going through a very serious scare with cancer to where he had to have a full bone marrow transplant. And during his time in the hospital, he had gotten a hold of the score for David Maslanka's Symphony 7. And for whatever reason, that piece really spoke to him. And as soon as he got out of the hospital, he had programmed it, and he had called David. And David at the time, was highly popular, sought after composer to come and do, guest things at different places. And Professor Adsit had called him without much time. And so he thought, hey, David, this is such a long shot. But I thought there's no harm in asking, are you free in a month and a half to come to the University of Hartford on this weekend for our performance. And his response was, I knew I kept that weekend free for some reason,
Huh.
and ended up coming to Hart and being a part of that, first performance after Glenn had come back. And there's a recording from that concert where there's some things said by David that really relate to Glenn's situation. So powerful interaction there, and he opened my eyes to that piece, and it's one of my favorite pieces in the repertoire now, for sure.
Well, a tradition, famously, is something that you do repeatedly, and then at some point you can't remember why you do it. But this one, I do know the reason. It's my less strictly resume-oriented band questions. And the first one is always, what's one of your favorite pieces of band music that you've played, outdoors or indoors? And I'm not sure whether you just talked about it or not.
I would have to say probably the most recent experience that was somewhat mind-blowing and really educational for me was playing the Winds of Nagual with the UMass Wind Ensemble. And I watched my teacher, Matt Westgate, do that piece for the first time, and seeing his process of, rehearsing it and almost being in a place where he was a little uncomfortable, which I had never seen. And it was really helpful to me to be like, okay, like, you never stop learning on this
Mm.
journey. There's always something else to tackle. But I got to play trumpet on that one, and was one of the cornet soloists in the mariachi section, which was a blast. So that was a big one for me.
Well, a 180-degree pivot to the other direction. Is there a piece of band music that you have never played but you would like to?
Oh, yeah. Music for Prague, 1968. That is a piece that actually I got to hear the UMass Wind Ensemble. They were preparing to play it at CBDNA when I auditioned for my master's degree. So I walked into the band room and got to hear that piece and just be like, what is going on? It was just a different piece than I'd ever heard in the band world, and highly impressed me. And that's probably one of the main reasons I chose UMass. The wind ensemble was playing at such a high level with such impressive music that I knew that Matt Westgate was doing things right, and I was right. So
Now, is there a band that you would love to perform with that you haven't, either because you're not the right age or you're not in the right time period?
any of the military bands would be incredible. I think the Navy band would probably be number one for me. I've gotten to see many of them in performance, but I was really personally moved by a performance that they did a couple years ago at the Midwest Clinic. They were the featured group. I was very impressed with the emotional connection I felt with that band, maybe more so than any group concert band that I've heard play. So that would be the dream.
And my last question, which very often is my favorite question, have you got a favorite band story that you want to tell?
I do. This takes me all the way back to high school marching band, honestly. And I was a student in my senior year. We got to go and play in the Fiesta Bowl in Arizona. Back then, it was put on by Tostitos. So it was
Ah,
the
yes.
Fiesta Bowl. So I think there were probably 50 high school marching bands that participated in this kind of travel festival that we were in. And we had some great opportunities while we were there. We got to go see the Grand Canyon, which unfortunately the day we went, it was a whiteout, snowing. So I didn't see
Oh,
much of the Grand
oh,
Canyon.
what?
But we traveled to the top of the mountain and we had some snowball fights and we had a blast. But part of what we did on the day of the bowl game was that they have all these bands gather and pull out a field-sized American flag during the national anthem. So we're not playing, we are simply the mechanism to get the flag across the field. So you have this little practice before the game where they're explaining everything to you. We do a run through of it. I'm on the side of the flag that is the runners. So we are running, pulling it across the field while the other group is just standing on the sideline holding it. So we run through the practice, everything goes fine. We get to the stadium, and everybody is on the field like with their jaws disconnected because of the atmosphere. It's just packed college stadium. There was so much to see and hear, and it was kind of overwhelming. And I remember being one of the students that was like, guys, we have to listen, pay attention. This air horn is going to go off, and we have a job to do. And looking around, it didn't seem like there were many other people concerned about this. I forgot to mention that we'd just gotten brand new uniforms, and they were in dire need of replacement. I think we were marching around in uniforms from the 1970s. When you joined the band, one of the things you had to do was go out and buy a pair of red suspenders so that you could even hold up the pants. This is how old the uniforms were. So my senior year, we got brand new white uniforms, and we were wearing them to this festival. So we're all in our band uniforms. We're getting ready to pull this flag. The air horn goes off, and I see about 25% of the people that are on the runner side just go down, just get clotheslined by this flag because they're not paying attention, right? And so I'm thinking as I'm pulling this, like, okay, this is going to be more weight for those of us that are left, but we got to get it across. And I'm thinking, this thing is heavy, heavy, heavy. I didn't know why it was so heavy until we got about halfway across the field, and I realized that one of my flute playing friends was hanging on and being dragged underneath the flag, like just riding it across the field. She was too afraid to let go, like the rest of the people that got clotheslined.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, and so by the end, when she reappeared, the entire back of our brand new white, beautiful uniforms was solid green, and she had a great little smear that went right across the center of the field where the logo was, for the Tostitos Bowl. And I mean, she was a good friend of mine, but I don't know that I've laughed harder than that in my life. She was embarrassed at the time, but I think really enjoys telling that story now. My band director, I can remember, was not amused like the rest of us were, but that's one of my favorite marching band stories.
I don't think that I will hear an answer to that question like that one again.
Yep. Very unique.
I'm so pleased to have been able to make good on my promise to myself to bring you aboard for a conversation like this, and that the Central Connecticut Band is back up and running, since it's a group that did as much for me as I might have done in service to it, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, Central Connecticut State University, like we talked about, is on the up and up, and I think a great place to come to study music or to be a part of the bands. I'm especially looking for non-majors that want to come and play with us. So if anybody out there is listening that has students that are looking at Central either to be in the music program or just to keep participating in music, would love to have them.
Is there anywhere else online where people can follow what you're up to, a project of yours, or just find information about you?
Yeah, I recently published my website. It's just jamesminnix.com. And you can see some conducting videos on there. I'm still working on uploading some parts from my dissertation project, which included a Handel transcription that can be available to any band director that's interested in performing Baroque music. So that dissertation can be found on ProQuest, and then parts will be uploaded on my website if you'd like to go and print those parts and do it with your band, totally free of charge. Feel free. It's an interesting piece that is for two antiphonal wind groups and then band in the middle. It was done originally for two antiphonal wind groups and strings, and the groups for antiphonal winds are quite a bit different now with modern instrumentation than it was in Handel's time. So a lot of interesting reworking to the piece, but the dissertation talks a lot about how to communicate Baroque style to a young ensemble, which is an issue that I ran into doing this project. So those parts are also on the website if you're interested.
Conductor, teacher, arranger, orchestrator. James MINNIX, thank you again for your willingness to do this, and continued good fortune down there in New Britain.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, we'll take a break, and then I have a District of Columbia story or two that will get you chuckling, I think. More BandWagon in a moment. Here comes the dogfight. This week's dogfight contains, as promised, a couple of brief inauguration stories of mine. They come from the January 1985 inauguration, Ronald Reagan's second. My alma mater band, the Minuteman one, was invited rather late in the parade planning process, thanks to some communications involving one of Massachusetts' congressional representatives. On New Year's Eve, our fine director George Parks sent out a letter, a physical letter, so that letter didn't arrive in mailboxes until sometime the next week. That's how close this was cutting it. And it said this, in part: "Happy holidays and congratulations. I hope that by now you've heard the good news. The Minuteman Marching Band is going to Washington. Let me fill you in on some of the details. As you probably know, the New Bedford High School Band was chosen by the inaugural committee to represent Massachusetts in the 1985 inaugural parade. This news was a big disappointment to me, primarily because I was hoping to provide you with a very memorable experience as a member of the Minuteman Marching Band. If we've ever had a band that deserves such an honor, it was the 1984 UMMB. During the past 2 weeks, Jerry Grady, John Haidt, and the Alumni Association and others have worked diligently with Congressman Silvio Conte's office to find a resolution to this situation. In spite of a large effort, it appeared that the situation was hopeless, and suddenly, on December 27th, we received the enclosed invitation. Although the invitation is not for the position that we had originally hoped for, it does provide many interesting opportunities. Perhaps the greatest advantage over our last appearance in the inaugural parade is that we will not be limited to 1 or 2 parade selections. Instead, we will have the opportunity to play through our entire repertoire and do what we do best, entertain a large audience. In addition, the inaugural prelude pageant on January 18th is expected to draw between 10,000 and 40,000 people. The enclosed invitation from the inaugural committee noted that the UMass band would be what was known as a route band. The invite said, in part, route bands are chosen by the inaugural committee as an honor position to perform at static locations along the parade route and have the honor of entertaining the President of the United States as he moves from the White House to the Capitol for the swearing-in ceremonies. They will also play an important role in entertaining the parade audience along the route prior to the start of this historic event. So our itinerary said that we'd be meeting on Thursday the 17th in Amherst to rehearse madly, depart Amherst and stop on the way to D.C. to be the pep band at a UMass men's basketball game being held at the Springfield Civic Center, because sure, why not, and then we'd continue on to D.C. We checked into our hotel at some ridiculous hour, caught a few Z's, and then rehearsed for and performed at the prelude pageant that evening. All that worked out well, and when the special inauguration commemorative issue of Time magazine came out in late January, it included a couple of photos of the UMMB playing that gig. And predictably, all the copies at the university store sold out split seconds after they hit the shelves. I still have my copy. That, though, is where the weekend started to go not exactly according to plan, and most of the off-the-rails stories stem from a snowstorm that hit D.C. that weekend and the forecast that predicted high temperatures on Inauguration Day in the single digits. The Los Angeles Times later reported that President Reagan took the presidential oath of office on Sunday the 20th in a low-key White House ceremony, and hours later took the historically rare step of canceling the inaugural parade and shifting the public inauguration indoors because of the new fallen snow, bitter winds, and record cold temperatures. The parade was called off after officials were warned on Sunday night that the expected sub-zero weather conditions would expose thousands of marchers and spectators to serious risks of frostbite and other medical problems. When President Reagan took the oath Sunday, the outside temperature stood at only 9 degrees, with a wind chill factor equal to 22 degrees below zero, apparently making it the coldest day ever for a presidential swearing-in. Indeed, Washington's previous record low temperature for January 20th, 8 degrees, was shattered as the thermometer went to 1 degree below zero at 11 p.m. Sunday and then dropped from there. Officials scrambled to organize some sort of indoor event at the Washington Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, the home of the NHL's Washington Capitals, so that the thousands of scheduled parade participants could still gather with the president on Sunday afternoon. More about that presently. During my time as a playing member, assisting instructor, or director of various bands, I've had experience answering the question of how should we behave, specifically while in uniform or while wearing any apparel which directly identifies us as band personnel, band jackets and the like. The simple answer is we conduct ourselves 100% appropriately so that nobody can possibly take away a bad impression of the ensemble. Guilt by association may not be fair, but it's real. So, at the Capitol Center, all the bands were lined up usually 2 by 2, no instruments but in full uniform, on the concourse encircling the arena, waiting to be led to our seats inside. As we, UMass, waited silently at parade rest, a number of us glanced over and observed a member of another band smoking in uniform. Setting aside whatever you may think of smoking, and whatever your particular band's controlled substances policy happens to be, hey gang, either everybody smokes or nobody does. It's the definition of uniform. So this kid is on his own, leaning against a water cooler, uniform jacket hanging open, smoking a cigarette. You're kidding, right? When you're at the inaugural in full uniform and you light one up. I'm pretty sure Mr. Parks spotted this at about the same time we did. He decided it would be an appropriate moment to call us to attention in that enclosed space, and so he did. We responded to the command, particularly sharply and loudly. That startled member of the other band actually dropped his cigarette. If it had been merely a coincidence, it was nevertheless a grand one. Anyway, our official outdoor inaugural commitment had been called off, but instead we were offered an opportunity to gather on Sunday morning behind one of the mammoth sets of parade viewing bleachers that had been set up along Pennsylvania Avenue and play a few bars of music so that an ABC camera crew could make a video recording of it all for use the next morning as a video transition out of a commercial break on Good Morning America. And that was the setup for arguably one of the top 5 anecdotes in UMass band history. Change my mind. By Sunday morning, the snow had begun to fall, aggressively. Now, being from New England, none of us were fazed by snow. But D.C. was. I don't care whether it was a Sunday morning or not. There was nobody out there but us. So we arrived on Pennsylvania Avenue, got into a concert formation of some kind, and began to play. Take after take after take. At least 7 or 8 of them when we stopped counting. Somehow, I guess things kept going not as well as was hoped, or maybe ABC wanted to get extra footage just in case, or something. In the middle of the formation, all we knew was that it was cold. So cold that brass valves and slides were beginning to misbehave, not to mention frozen chops. Not to mention twirlers only in their relatively thin warm-up suits, and color guard members in their dinner jacket and tights uniforms. And honestly, there's only so much clothing you could stuff under the 1980s vintage band uniforms. Oh, and it was snowing hard enough that after every other take, we all had to dust snow off our shoulders. The grumbling, I have to admit, was beginning. So, instead of playing anything like Malagueña or the 1812 Overture, we were instead left to just play our version of the Michigan Let's Go Blue cheer. And on probably take 9 of the video shoot, but again, who's counting, Mr. Parks fired up the playing, conducted the cutoff, turned and looked up at the ABC cameras on the top row of the bleachers, 2 stories high, and spoke his line, which should have been, "We're the University of Massachusetts Minuteman Marching Band performing at the President's Inauguration, and we'd like to say to you, Good morning, America." And then we should have played the cheer again, and should have followed that with our own Good Morning America. Ah, the best laid plans. It didn't go right on take 9 either. I do think we got it right a couple of tries later, and then scurried back to our waiting buses, which were ready to take us somewhere to get some food, probably, before we had to get over to the Capitol Center so that we could be in place to scare the daylights out of a high school band kid. Oh, and see the president and vice president. And much later that day, we got the disappointing word. After all that, it had been so cold outside that the ABC cameras turned out not to have been working. They hadn't captured any of it. At least that's what the ABC people told us. So much for our national television debut, and any evidence of our frostbitten work, such as it was. And that, you would think, would be the end of that story. You would be mistaken. Quite a long time later, we learned that up on the top of the bleachers that morning, near the ABC camera crew, was another intrepid person with a video camera, who shot video of it all, and her camera did work. Her name was Linda Paul. She was one of the UMass drum majors in 1981, the last time the band had marched an inaugural parade, and she already had a grand reputation for being one of our most mischievous alumni. And at a post-season band banquet a couple years later, she unveiled the video, and proved that we had exaggerated exactly none of that story. And I have that video. And you will now hear take number 9. Wait, 2, 3, 4. Marching band performing at the President's Inauguration. I would like to wish you happy morning. 1, 2. So, if you happen to cross paths with a UMass band alum from the early or mid-1980s, all you have to do is say to them, "Happy morning," and you will either get a belly laugh or a punch in the nose. Anywho, if you have any inauguration parade stories of your own, it's never too late to send them along. Use the contact links that I'll mention at the end of this episode, and who knows, that might be a future dogfight segment. For now, I'll return after this break to wrap things up for this week. Thanks for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the CODA. This week's CODA is a brief correction.
What? Disappointed!
From a listener named James MINNIX. Not long after we recorded this week's trio section, James dropped me an email and said, "I realized that I made a mistake during our interview and said Maslanka 7 instead of Maslanka Symphony 4. I don't know if there's any way to fix in post, but it would be great if possible." Only too happy to oblige. And James sent me a link, which I will put into the show notes, to a YouTube video of Glenn Adzit's performance of Maslanka 4, before which Dr. Adzit told the story from the podium, which James offered an overview of during our conversation in the trio section. That's BandWagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. BandWagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hammerton Media, from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes of the pod's website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback, let me know what you like or what you think might change. You can do that using the email address heybandwagon@yahoo.com, or leave a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that I do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. Those contact links and links to this week's news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, James MINNIX, can be found in our show notes, as can a link to BandWagon's merch store thanks to the good folks at TeePublic. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share it in the direction of someone whom you think might not be a listener yet. Word of mouth really is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with the pod every week, subscribe to BandWagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are sold. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do this all again next week. I'm Rob Hammerton. Detail, fall out.